Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 24, and it is titled The Kiss and Other Stories, written by Anton Chekhov. And this is part 2, and we left off at the top of page 18. And off we go. Only the worst numbskull and blockhead can't get beer. Cannaville! Everyone knows there's no beer here, said Merlosevuk, without lifting his eyes from the messenger of Europe. You believe that? Exclaimed Lobichenko. Lord in heaven, drop me on the moon, and in 5 minutes I'll find both beer and women. I will find them myself. Call me a rascal if you don't. He dressed slowly, silently, lighted a cigarette, and went out. Rabbik, grabbik, labbik, he muttered, stomping in the hall. I won't go alone, devil take me. Ryabovik, come for a walk. What? And he got no answer. He returned, undressed slowly, and lay down. Merzlikakov sighed, dropped the messenger of Europe, and put out the light. Well? He muttered Lobitoiko, puffing his cigarette in the dark. Ryabovich pulled the bedclothes up to his chin. Bedcloths up to his chin, curled himself into a ball, and strained his imagination to join the twinkling images into one coherent whole. But the vision fled him. He soon fell asleep, and his last impression was that he had been caressed and gladdened, that into his life had crept something strange and indeed ridiculous, but uncommonly good and radiant. And this thought did not forsake him, even in his dreams. When he awoke, the feeling of anointment and peppermint chill were gone, but joy, as on the night before, filled every vein. He looked entranced at the window panes, gilded by the rising sun, and listened to the noises outside. Someone spoke loudly under the very window. It was Lebedowski, commander of his battery, who had just overtaken the brigade. He was talking to the sergeant major loudly, owing to lack of practice and soft speech. And what next? He roared. During yesterday's shoeing, Your Honor, Gulubichdik was pricked. The felcher ordered clay and vinegar, and last night, Your Honor, Mechanic Artemov was drunk, and the lieutenant ordered him to be put on the limber of the reserve gun carriage. The sergeant major added that Karpov had forgotten the 10 pegs and the new lanyards for the friction tubes, and that the officers had spent the evening at General von Rabik's. But here at the window appeared Lebedowski's red-bearded face. He blinked his short-sighted eyes at the drowsy men in bed and greeted them. Is everything all right? The saddle-wheeler galled his withers with the new yoke, answered Lobitoiko. The commander sighed, mused a moment, and shouted, I am thinking of calling on Alexander Yekaronova. I want to see her. Goodbye. I will catch you up before night. 15 minutes later, the brigade resumed its march. As he passed von Rabik's barns, Rybovich turned his head and looked at the house. The Venetian blinds were down. Evidently all still slept, and among them slept she who had kissed him but a few hours before. He tried to visualize her asleep. He projected the bedroom window opened wide, with green branches peering in. The freshness of the morning air, the smell of poplars, lilacs, and roses, the bed, a chair, the dress which rustled last night, a pair of tiny slippers, a ticking watch on the table. All these came to him clearly, with every detail, but the features, the kind, sleepy smile, all in short, that was essential and characteristic, fled his imagination as quicksilver flees the hand. When he had covered half a verst, he again turned back. The yellow church, the house, gardens, and river were bathed in light, imaging an azure sky. The green-banked river, specked with silver sunshine, flakes, was inexpressibly fair, and looking at Miss Chesky for the last time, Ryabinov felt sad, as if parting forever was something very near and dear. By the road before him stretched familiar, uninteresting scenes. To the right and left, fields of young rye and buckwheat with hopping rooks. In front, dust and the napes of human necks. Behind, the same dust and faces. Ahead of the column marched 4 soldiers with swords. That was the advance guard. Next came the bandsmen, advance guard, and bandsmen, like mutes in a funeral procession, ignored the regulation intervals and marched too far. Ignored the regulation intervals and marched too far ahead. Ryabinov, with the first gun of battery number 5, could see 4 batteries ahead. To a layman, the long, lumbering march of an artillery brigade is novel, interesting, inexplicable. It is hard to understand why a single gun needs so many men, why so many such strangely harnessed horses are needed to drag it. But to Ryabovich, a master of all these things, it was profoundly dull. He had learned years ago why a solid sergeant major rides beside the officer in front of each battery, why the sergeant major is called the Unosini, and why the drivers of leaders and wheelers ride behind him. Ryabovich knew why the near horses are called saddle horses and why the off horses are called lead horses, and all of this was interesting beyond words. On one of the wheelers rode a soldier still covered with yesterday's dust and with a cumbersome, ridiculous guard on his right leg. But Ryabovich, knowing the use of this leg guard, found it in no way ridiculous. The drivers, mechanically and with occasional cries, flourished their whips. The guns in themselves were impressive. The limbers were packed with tarpaulin-covered sacks of oats, and the guns themselves hung round with teapots and satchels. Looked like harmless animals, guarded for some obscure reason by men and horses. In the lee of the gun tramped 6 gunners, swinging their arms, and behind each gun came more Unosini, leaders, wheelers, and yet more guns, each as ugly and uninspiring as the one in front. And as every one of the 6 batteries in the brigade had 4 guns, the procession stretched along the road at least half a verst. It ended with a wagon train, with which, its head bent in thought, walked the donkey, Magar, brought from Turkey by a battery commander. Dead to his surroundings, Ryabovich marched onward, looking at the napes ahead or at the faces behind. Had it not been for last night's event, he would have been half asleep. But now he was absorbed in novel, entrancing thoughts. When the brigade set out that morning, he had tried to argue that the kiss had no significance save as a trivial, though mysterious adventure, that it was without real import, and that to think of it seriously was to behave himself absurdly. But logic soon flew away and surrendered him to his vivid imaginings. At times he saw himself in von Rabich's dining room, tete-a-tete with a composite being formed of the girl in lilac and the blonde in black. At times he closed his eyes and pictured himself with a different, this time quite an unknown girl of cloudy features. He spoke to her, caressed her, bent over her shoulder, and imagined war and parting, then reunion, the first supper together, children. "To the brakes!" rang the command as they topped the brow of each hill. Ryabovich also cried, "To the brakes!" and each time dreaded that the cry would break the magic spell and recall him to realities. They passed a big country house. Ryabovich looked across the fence into the garden and saw a long path, straight as a ruler, carpeted with yellow sand and shaded by young birches, in an ecstasy of enchantment. He pictured little feminine feet treading the yellow sand, and in a flash, imagination restored the woman who had kissed him, the woman he had visualized after supper the night before. The image settled in his brain and never afterwards forsook him. The spell reigned until midday, when a loud command came from the rear of the column. "Attention! Eyes right! Officers!" In a clique, drawn by a pair of white horses, appeared the general of brigade. He stopped at the second battery and called out something which no one understood. Up galloped several officers, among them Ryabovich. "Well, how goes it?" The general blinked his red eyes and continued, "Are there any sick?" Hearing the answer, the little skinny general mused a moment, turned to an officer and said, "The driver of your third gun-wheeler has taken off his leg guard and hung it on the limber. Canonnier, punish him!" Then raised his eyes to Ryabovich. He added, "And in your battery, I think, the harness is too loose." Having made several other equally tiresome remarks, he looked at Lobitoyko and laughed. "Why do you look so downcast, Lieutenant Lobitoyko? You are sighing for Madame Lopukov, eh? Gentlemen, he is pining for Madame Lopukov." Madame Lopukov was a tall, stout lady, long past 40, being partial to big woman, regardless of age. The general ascribed the same taste to his subordinates. The officer smiled respectfully, and the general, pleased that he had said something caustic and laughable, touched the coachman's back and saluted. The caliche whirled away. All this, though it seemed to me impossible and unearthly, it is really very commonplace. Though Ryabovich, watching the clouds of dust raised by the general's carriage, it is an everyday event, and within everyone's experience. This old general, for instance, must have loved in his day. He is married now, and has children. Captain Watcher is also married, and his wife loves him, though he has an ugly red neck and no waist. Salmonov is coarse and a typical Tartar, but he has had a romance ending in marriage. I, like the rest, must go through it all sooner or later. And the thought that he was an ordinary man, and that his life was ordinary, rejoiced and consoled him. He boldly visualized her and his happiness, and let his imagination run mad. Towards evening the brigade ended its march. While the other officers sprawled in their tents, Ryabovich, Mertzlikov, and Lobitoyko sat around a packing case and supped. Mertzlikov ate slowly, and resting the messenger of Europe on his knees, read on steadily. Lobitoyko, chattering without cease, poured beer into his glass, but Ryabovich, whose head was dizzy from uninterrupted daydreams, ate in silence. When he had drunk 3 glasses, he felt tipsy and weak, and an overmastering impulse forced him to relate his adventure to his comrades. "A most extraordinary thing happened to me at von Rabich's," he began, doing his best to speak in an indifferent, ironical tone. "I was on my way, you understand, from the billiard room," and he attempted to give a very detailed history of the kiss. But in a minute he had told the whole story. In that minute he had exhausted every detail, and it seemed to him terrible that the story required such a short time. It ought, he felt, to have lasted all the night. As he finished, Lobitoyko, who as a liar himself believed in no one, laughed incredulously. Mertzlikov frowned, and with his eyes still glued to the messenger of Europe, said indifferently, "God knows who it was." "She threw herself on your neck, you say, and didn't cry out." "Some lunatic, I expect." "Must have been a lunatic," agreed Ryobovich. "I too have had adventures of that kind," began Lobitoyko, making a frightened face. "I was on my way to Kovno. I traveled second class. The carriage was packed and I couldn't sleep, so I gave the guard a ruble, and he took my bag and I put him in a coupe. And put me in a coupe. I lay down and pulled my rug over me. It was pitch dark, you understand. Suddenly I felt someone tapping my shoulder and breathing in my face. I stretched out my hand and felt an elbow. Then I opened my eyes. Imagine, a woman! Coal black eyes, lips red as good coral, nostrils breathing passion, breasts buffers. "Draw it mild," interrupted Merlitzikov in his quiet voice. "I can believe about the breasts, but if it was pitch dark, how could you see the lips?" By laughing at Merlichikov's lack of understanding, Lobitoyko tried to shuffle out of the dilemma. The story annoyed Ryobovich. He rose from the box, lay on his bed, and swore that he would never again take anyone into his confidence. Life in camp passed without event. The days flew by, each like the other before. But on every one of these days Ryobovich felt, thought, and acted as a man in love. When at daybreak his servant brought him cold water and poured it over his head, it flashed at once into his half-awakened brain that something good and warm and caressing had crept into his life. At night, when his comrades talked of love and of women, he drew in his chair, and his face was the face of an old soldier who talks of battles in which he had taken part. And when the rowdy officers, led by Setter Lobitoyko, made Don Juanesque raids upon the neighboring suburb, Ryobovich thought he accompanied them. Though he accompanied them, was morose and conscience-struck, and mentally asked for forgiveness in free hours and sleepless nights, when his brain was obsessed by memories of childhood, or his father, his mother, of evenings akin and dear he remembered always. Miss Chesky, the dancing horse, von Rabbig's wife, so like the ex-empress, Egwene, the dark room, and the chink in the door. On the 31st of August, he left camp, this time not with the whole brigade, but with only 2 batteries, as an exile returning to his native land. He was agitated and enthralled by daydreams. He longed passionately for the queer-looking horse, the church, the insincere von Rabbiks, the dark room, and that internal voice which cheats so often the lovelorn, whispered an assurance that he should see her again. But doubt tortured him. How should he meet her? What must he say? Would she have forgotten the kiss? If it came to the worst, he consoled himself. If he never saw her again, he might walk once more through the dark room and remember. Towards evening, the white barns and well-known church rose on the horizon. Ryobovich's heart beat wildly. He ignored the remark of an officer who rode by. He forgot the whole world, and he gazed greedily at the river glimmering afar, at the green roofs, at the dove cote over which fluttered birds, dyed golden by the setting sun. As he rode towards the church and heard again the quartermaster's raucous voice, he expected every second a horseman to appear from behind the fence and invite the officers to tea. But the quartermaster ended his harangue. The officers hastened to the village, and no horseman appeared. When Rabbik hears from the peasants that we are back, He will send for us, thought Ryabovich, and so assured was he of this, that when he entered the hut, he failed to understand why his comrades had lighted a candle, and why the servants were preparing the samovar. A painful agitation oppressed him. He lay on his bed. A moment later he rose to look for the horseman. But no horseman was in sight. Again he lay down, again he rose, and this time, impelled by restlessness, went into the street and walked towards the church. The square was dark and deserted. On the hill stood 3 silent soldiers. When they saw Ryabovich, they started and saluted, and he, returning their salute, began to descend the well-remembered path. Beyond the stream, in a sky stained with purple, the moon slowly rose. 2 chattering peasant women walked in a kitchen garden and pulled cabbage leaves. Behind them, their log cabins stood out black against the sky. The river bank was as it had been in May. The bushes were the same, things different only in that the nightingale no longer sang, that it smelt no longer of poplars and young grass. When he reached von Rabbig's garden, Ryabovich peered through the wicket gate. Silence and darkness reigned, save only the white birch trunks and patches of pathway. The whole garden merged in a black, impenetrable shade. Ryabovich listened greedily and gazed intent. For a quarter of an hour he loitered. Then, hearing no sound and seeing no light, he walked wearily towards home. He went down to the river. In front rose the general's bathing box, and white towels hung on the rail of the bridge. He climbed onto the bridge and stood still, then, for no reason whatever, touched a towel. It was clammy and cold. He looked down at the river, which sped past, swiftly murmuring almost inaudibly against the bathing box piles. Near the left bank glowed the moon's ruddy reflection, overrun by ripples which stretched it, tore it in two, and it seemed would sweep it away as twigs and shavings are swept. And I think we'll stop there for part 2.